Hey there. Today we're diving into something we all use every single day, but rarely stop to actually think about.
Let me guess. Coffee.
Huh,
Yeah.
good one. But no, even more fundamental language itself.
I see where you're going with this.
And specifically, how it can be a force for both good and evil all at the same time.
Right, right. It's true. We've all felt the sting of a harsh word or been moved by a really powerful speech. But what is it about language, that gives it that power? That's the question.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we'll be unpacking today.
We're talking about how this whole good versus evil thing plays out in everything. Religion, philosophy, heck, even those awkward text message chains we've all been part of. Don't tell me you haven't had one of those.
No, too many. But it's funny. It's fascinating to me how even the word God can spark such different interpretations.
Oh, absolutely.
One source I was looking at, you pointed out how it often relates to invocation. You're calling upon something. Doesn't exactly scream bring on the war, does it?
No, not quite. And that's what's so interesting here. That etymology, you know what I mean? It suggests that conflict might actually be a result of divine action, not the action itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's like the difference between, I don't know, an earthquake and a rescue worker. Yeah. Both involve, upheaval, but
Exactly. Perfect analogy. And speaking of how language can be interpreted in different ways, even in religious texts, it often seems metaphorical, right? Like I was reading in Isaiah, God's described as a man of war, but, we need to dig beneath the surface a bit there, don't we?
100%. Yeah, it's definitely not about literal battles.
Right, right. It points more to a cosmic struggle.
Yeah.
Light and darkness, order and chaos, the classic battle, really. But more than that, I think it highlights how the same words can be understood in completely different ways, depending on who's doing the interpreting.
It's so true. And this isn't just some abstract thing for theologians to ponder, is it?
No, not at all. This whole thing about interpretation, about how much depends on context. Think about how often miscommunication happens, even in a simple text message.
Ugh. Don't even get me started. I swear half my friends would think I'd completely lost it based on my texting tone.
Right, because we don't have that tone of voice. It's easy for a text to come off as way harsher than you meant it to be.
Totally. Which actually reminds me of a key point from the sources we've been digging into, how much we rely on things like tone of voice, facial expressions, all that stuff that's completely missing in written language.
Yeah, and it's not just what was I going to say? Oh, right. It's not just tone of voice either. It's the entire context of the conversation, the relationship between the people involved, even things like
what's not being said.
Yes, exactly. One of the sources mentioned Wittgenstein, the philosopher, you know him. He had this idea of that which we cannot speak of. Sometimes the silence, or the things that are left unsaid, those things carry just as much weight as the words themselves.
True, that. But even with all its limitations, all the ways we can mess it up, language shapes our reality in some pretty profound ways, don't you think?
Absolutely, yeah. It's not just how we describe reality. It actually influences how we see it. It's kind of mind-blowing.
Totally. I was reading about how some cultures don't even have a future tense in their language. And because of that, they experience time completely differently.
Wow, that's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in action right there. Language shaping perception, not just describing it.
Exactly. Which is pretty amazing, but this power to shape reality, it's not always a good thing, is it?
Yeah, you've got a point there. It's no accident that things like, propaganda and manipulation rely so heavily on language, right?
Right. Some of the sources were really getting into how, even with good intentions, our words can have unintended consequences, sometimes even harmful ones.
Yeah, for sure. Language it's a tool, right? And like any tool, it can be used to build amazing things or to cause serious damage.
So true. It's on the one hand, we have all these rules, grammar and all that. But then we also have things like poetry slams, where people are, bending or breaking those rules to create something new and powerful.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what's so fascinating about language. It has this tension, this duality, I guess you could call it, that gives us incredible expressive power, but also a huge moral responsibility to use it well.
So even with the best of intentions, we can still totally mess things up. I'm thinking of all those times I put my foot in my mouth, said something that sounded totally fine in my head.
But tell me about it. We've all been there, right? We think we're being all encouraging and supportive, and then bam, it backfires. It's like that saying.
Yeah. You're so talented, you don't even need to practice. What starts as a compliment, totally discouraging effort.
Ouch, yeah. I can definitely see how that one could backfire spectacularly. Good intentions, but
the best of intentions, but sometimes our words just don't land the way we hoped they would.
Exactly. And that's where all those other things come into play, right? Your tone of voice, body language, all those things that add another layer to this whole idea of language's duality. It's not just the words themselves, it's everything else we bring to the table.
So true. It's like, how many times have you gotten an email that just rubbed you the wrong way and you had to reread it a few times to realize, like, oh, they probably didn't mean it like that?
Yeah.
But without that in-person interaction, it's so easy to misinterpret, which actually reminds me of something else we were talking about earlier, how language can be used to manipulate and mislead just as easily as it can be used to inform and inspire.
Right. And one of the ways that happens is through what are called logical fallacies. You're familiar with those? They're basically flawed arguments that sound good on the surface, but like crumble under scrutiny.
I've definitely heard the term, but honestly, I'm a little fuzzy on the details. Can you give me an example of one I might come across?
Sure. One of the most common ones is the ad hominem fallacy, where instead of actually like adjusting the argument itself, someone attacks the person making the argument.
So instead of debating the idea, you go after the person. That sounds awfully familiar, like something you'd see on social media.
Unfortunately, yeah, it's everywhere online. And it's a perfect example of how language can be weaponized, to shut down critical thinking and actually prevent meaningful dialogue from even happening.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, whether or not an argument is valid has nothing to do with the character of the person making it. It should be about the ideas themselves.
Precisely. And that's what's so dangerous about these fallacies. They distract us from engaging with the actual issues at hand. And they can be incredibly effective, especially when they tap into our emotions. But luckily, once you're aware of them, you can start to spot them and call them out.
Which is exactly what we're going to do. But first, a quick break. We'll be right back to dig even deeper into the power of language and how we can use it for good in our own lives. It's like we can get so caught up in the weeds of how people are saying things that we completely miss what they're actually saying.
100%. And to me, that just highlights the importance of being intentional with our own language, right? Not just in how we speak, but also in how we listen.
Totally. Because it's not like we can just avoid using language altogether, can we?
I wish. Could you imagine trying to order a coffee using only interpretive dance?
Oh, man. The amount of accidental interpretive latte art. But you're right. It's not about avoiding language. It's about understanding its power and using it for good. Which, speaking of, one source described language as a tool, and that really resonated with me. It can be used to build or destroy, inspire, or manipulate.
Wow, yeah. That's a really powerful way to think about it, because just like with any tool, the impact comes down to the person wielding it, right?
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole discussion so fascinating and a little bit unnerving, to be honest. We use language every single day, multiple times a day. But how often do we really stop to think about the sheer power it holds?
You're so right. It's a power that's been recognized. Throughout history, right? Think about the ancient art of rhetoric, the ability to move entire nations with words. That was a highly prized skill back then.
Totally. And it's not just ancient history either. We see that same power at play constantly in political campaigns and advertising all over social media. It's crazy how these little things, these words, can literally shape opinions and even change the course of history.
It's true. And that's exactly why it's so important for us to be critical consumers of language. We can't just passively absorb everything we hear and read. We have to be aware of how easily it can be used to manipulate us.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we become more discerning listeners, more thoughtful speakers, more aware of those good and evil possibilities, in the words we use and encounter every day?
Right. That is the million-dollar question. And honestly, I don't think there's one easy answer. But I do think a big part of it is just awareness. Just acknowledging that language has this duality, that it's not inherently good or evil, but can be used for either purpose.
Okay, so just being aware of it is a good first step.
It is. That's a huge step towards becoming more conscious communicators. But of course, it goes beyond that. We also have to be willing to examine our own biases and assumptions, to really listen to what other people are saying, even if we don't agree with them.
I was thinking about that earlier. Just having this conversation has already got me reflecting on all the times I've probably misinterpreted things or even unintentionally said something hurtful,
We all have those moments, but I think the important thing is to learn from them, right? To use them as opportunities to grow and become more mindful communicators.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm curious, do you have any practical tips? Let's say I'm scrolling through social media or reading a news article. Are there any red flags that should make me pause and think twice about what I'm consuming.
Totally. One of the biggest worries is emotionally charged language. When someone's using words that are clearly designed to elicit a strong emotional response, usually fear, anger, or outrage, but without necessarily providing any real substance or evidence to back it up.
Ooh, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Headlines like, they're coming for your fill in the blank, or this one simple trick will change your life forever.
It's almost like they're trying to bypass any kind of logic or critical thinking and go straight for my gut reaction.
Yes, exactly. And while those strong emotions, they can be powerful motivators, you always want to be wary when someone is trying to manipulate you with fear or anger instead of, logic and reason.
Okay, so watch out for the emotional bait. Got it. Anything else? Another one is vague or ambiguous language. When someone avoids giving specific details or making concrete claims, and instead relies on generalizations or sweeping statements.
So like when someone says, well, everybody knows that.
Yeah.
But then they don't actually offer any evidence or examples to back it up.
Exactly. That's classic vague language, and it's often used to shut down critical thinking and make it harder to challenge what they're saying.
Yes. It's like trying to have a conversation with a politician,
Yeah.
You can never quite pin them down on anything specific.
Right. It can be incredibly frustrating. And I bet if you were to actually press those people for specifics, ask them for evidence to support their claims, the conversation would probably get really slippery really quickly.
Oh, 100%. It's like they just want to make a point and then shut down any kind of further discussion or debate.
Exactly. And that's not how productive conversations work, right? We need to be able to ask questions, to disagree respectfully, and to be open to changing our minds when presented with new information.
So we've got emotionally charged language, vague or ambiguous language.
Yeah.
Are there any other, linguistic landmines we should be on the lookout for?
Well, we already touched on this a bit earlier, but it's worth reiterating logical fallacies. Those are basically flawed arguments that are often used to manipulate people and win arguments, even if their conclusions are wrong or misleading.
Oh, right. You mentioned the ad hominem fallacy earlier.
Exactly. That's a really common one. It's when someone attacks the person making an argument, like their character or their motives, instead of addressing the substance of the argument itself.
Right. So instead of debating whether or not a certain policy is a good idea, they go after the person who proposed it.
Exactly. They'll say something like, well, of course they would say that. They're insert insult here. Or don't listen to them. They're just trying to insert nefarious motive here. But here's the thing.
Even if the person is flawed, it doesn't mean their idea is inherently bad.
Exactly. It's a total distraction tactic, and it's often used to shut down legitimate debate and discredit anyone who disagrees with them.
It's so true. It's like, okay, maybe this person's kind of a jerk sometimes, but that doesn't mean their proposal for, improving public transportation is a bad idea. We have to be able to separate the person from the idea.
Yes. 1,000 times, yes. We need to evaluate arguments based on their own merits, not on who is making them, because otherwise we're just letting our biases and preconceptions dictate how we see the world, and that's not how we grow or learn or have productive conversations.
Okay, so we've got emotionally charged language, vague language, logical fallacies. That feels like a lot to watch out for.
It can feel overwhelming, I know. But the good news is simply being aware of these tactics, being able to recognize them when you see them, makes you much better equipped to spot them in the wild and avoid being swayed by them.
Okay, that is reassuring. So it's about being an active listener, right? Not just passively consuming information, but really thinking critically about what we're hearing and reading, asking questions, and not being afraid to challenge things that don't seem quite right.
Exactly. Engage with language in a mindful way, recognizing its power for both good and evil, and ultimately choose to use it to promote understanding, empathy, and connection.
I love that. Choosing to use language for good. But before we go down that road, there's actually something else I wanted to circle back to, something we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Cultural differences in language. Because what's considered persuasive or even just polite in one culture could be totally off-putting or even offensive in another, right?
Oh, absolutely. Cultural context is huge when it comes to how language is interpreted. I mean, think about it. A harmless joke in one culture could be deeply offensive in another. Even things like, how directly we speak, how we structure our sentences, how formally we address people, all of that can vary widely depending on the cultural context.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like even if you're fluent in another language, there's still so much more to learn about, the nuances of communication within that specific culture,
Exactly. It's so easy for misunderstandings to arise when we're not sensitive to those cultural differences, which is something that's more important now than ever, right? I mean, we live in an increasingly interconnected world where we're constantly interacting with people from different cultures and backgrounds.
You're preaching to the choir here.
Yeah.
I've totally had those travel moments where I've put my foot in my mouth saying something that I thought was totally innocent, but ended up being like really offensive in that particular context. It's definitely a humbling experience, that's for sure.
Oh, I've been there too. We all have. But you hit on something really important. It's an opportunity for growth. Because when we step outside our own cultural bubbles and encounter these different ways of using language, it forces us to confront our own assumptions and develop a deeper understanding of how communication works in other parts of the world.
It's so true. It can be challenging, this whole cross-cultural communication thing, but it's also a chance to expand our horizons and connect with people from different backgrounds in more meaningful and authentic ways. And in today's world, those skills are more valuable than ever.
Couldn't agree more. And I think it starts with a willingness to be humble, to admit when we don't know something, and to be open to learning from our mistakes.
Okay, so we've talked about the power of language, being critical listeners and speakers, navigating cross-cultural communication. But before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, language as a tool for good. Because as much as we've talked about its potential for like manipulation and misunderstanding, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that it can also be an incredibly powerful force for positive change in the world.
You're absolutely right. And that's ultimately what I hope people take away from this conversation, because for all its complexities and contradictions, language is still one of the most powerful tools we have for creating a better world.
I love that. So how do we do that? How do we use this tool of language to like build bridges instead of walls, create understanding instead of division?
That's the question, isn't it? And while there's no magic formula, I really do think it starts with intentionality, like making a conscious choice to use language in a way that is honest, respectful, and kind, even when, and maybe especially when we're interacting with people who hold different views than our own.
Easier said than done.
Yeah.
Right? It's easy to get caught up in the heat of the moment, especially in today's like very polarized world.
Oh, absolutely. It takes effort, it takes practice, but it's so worth it. Because even small changes in the way we use language can have a ripple effect on the world around us.
I like that. But what are some concrete ways we can like put that intentionality into practice? How can we actually use language for good in our daily lives?
Well, for one, we can be mindful of the words we choose, opting for language that is inclusive and affirming rather than language that is exclusive or demeaning.
So instead of saying, hey guys, which can be like alienating to people who don't identify as male, we can say, hey everyone, or hey folks.
Exactly. It's about making sure our language reflects our values of inclusivity and respect for all. And it's not about being politically correct. It's about recognizing that words have power and we have a responsibility to use them in a way that uplifts and empowers others rather than putting them down.
Okay, I'm with you. What else?
Another powerful way to use language for good is to practice active listening. And by that, I mean really making an effort to understand where the other person is coming from, asking clarifying questions, and trying to see the world from their perspective even, and maybe especially if you ultimately disagree with them.
Right. It's about putting your own opinions aside, at least for a moment, and just trying to connect with them on a human level.
You got it. It's so easy to get caught up in our own heads, in our own need to be right, or to convince the other person of our point of view. But when we can truly listen with empathy and compassion, it creates space for dialogue, for understanding, and sometimes even for finding common ground in unexpected places.
It's like that saying, seek first to understand, then to be understood. And in a world that feels so divided, active listening might be one of the most powerful tools we have for like building bridges and fostering understanding.
Yeah.
And it all starts with how we use language.
I love that. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do with language is simply to listen, to create space for someone else's story, to validate their experiences, and to offer support and encouragement without judgment.
It's funny you say that because I was just thinking about this quote I read recently, something along the lines of, often the kindest thing we can do is just shut up and listen.
Right. There's a certain beauty in recognizing that sometimes words aren't enough. Sometimes the most powerful communication happens in the silences, in the spaces between our words.
That's deep. It's like we've gone from the power of language to the power of silence and all the messy, nuanced space in between.
It's all connected, right? Language, silence, listening, understanding, it's all part of what makes us human.
Okay, so as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into language,
Yeah.
is there one final thought, one last nugget of wisdom that you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that language is both incredibly powerful and incredibly complex. It can be used for good or for evil, to build up or to tear down. But ultimately, we have a choice. We have the power to choose how we use it, how we let it shape us, and how we use it to shape the world around us.
It really makes you appreciate both how much potential there is for good and also how easy it is to mess things up, Like even when we have the best intentions.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance for sure. But I think the more aware we are of those potential pitfalls, the better equipped we are to avoid them.
Totally. But speaking of potential, there's one last thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap up, something you kind of hinted at earlier. The idea that language doesn't just shape our thoughts, but that we might be able to actually change our minds by changing how we use language.
I see where you're going with this. Yeah, it's a fascinating concept. The idea that we can rewire our own brains simply by changing the words we use.
Right. Like instead of being passive recipients of language, we can actually use it as a tool for self-transformation.
Right.
Is that too woo-woo?
Not at all. In fact, there's a growing body of research that suggests it's totally legit. Have you ever heard of cognitive reframing?
That rings a bell. It's like when you try to reframe a negative thought in a more positive light, right?
Exactly. So instead of saying, "Ugh, I'm dreading this presentation, I know I'm going to bomb it," you might say, okay, I'm a little nervous, but this is a great opportunity to share my ideas with the team and get some valuable feedback. And just by shifting the language you use, even if you don't fully believe it at first.
You can actually change your emotional response to the situation.
Exactly. And over time, by consciously choosing more positive and empowering language, you can actually rewire your brain to focus on the good, to see possibilities instead of obstacles.
Wow, that's pretty amazing when you think about it. It's like we have this incredible power at our fingertips, literally, to change our thoughts, our feelings, maybe even our entire outlook on life, just by changing the way we speak.
It's true. And it's not just about, slapping on a fake smile and pretending everything is perfect. It's about recognizing that our words have power, both internally and externally. And that by choosing our words carefully, by being mindful of the language we use, we can actually create a more positive and fulfilling reality for ourselves and for those around us.
Well, okay, I am officially mind blown. So to bring it all back to the duality of language we've been exploring, it's not just that language can be used for good or evil, but that it also has this incredible potential for self-transformation, for healing, for creating positive change from the inside out.
You've got it. And I think that's a really powerful message to end on, don't you? That even amidst all the noise and chaos of the world, even with all the ways language can be misused and misinterpreted, we still have the power to choose how we use it, how we let it shape us, and ultimately how we use it to shape the world around us.
Beautifully put. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive and certainly given us all a lot to think about.
It has. And I hope it's inspired our listeners to be more mindful of the words they use, to recognize the power and the responsibility that comes with language, and to use it to create a more compassionate, understanding, and just generally awesome world.
Hear, hear. Thanks so much for joining me on this linguistic adventure. Until next time, happy listening.